And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this week we've got a pretty special episode where we're going to be interviewing Andrew Pickering, who is the author of the Cybernetic Brain, which we covered in a couple of episodes a few episodes ago. Really exciting stuff, you know. We're big fans, and this turns out to be a pretty sweet interview.
Yeah, very enjoyable. And if you have not listened to those episodes and have not read the book, you may want to go back and listen to them, because we don't give a whole summary of the book or anything like that. So if you want that, go back and listen to those other episodes, then come back here and listen to the interview. Otherwise, enjoy.
Enjoy. So, Andrew, thanks for coming along to talk to us today. We really appreciate you taking the time out.
No, thank you. I appreciate you reading my book.
It's been just loved it. I guess this is my second time reading it, but I still really got a lot out of it. I really appreciated just bring the history to this stuff, and constructing a history we could follow. We've done some other sort of intellectual histories that were a little bit rough, but that one was the Cybernetic Brain was just so readable.
I found it absolutely transformative to read, you know, honestly, because it's just such a unique field, you know, and that is it's not really understood very well, and to have this really clear writing that just explained it in these very clear terms was transformative. You know, it actually changed the way I look at the world, you know.
I mean, you know, I really enjoyed writing it because they're such great stories. You know, the projects these guys got up to are just so fascinating and imaginative. So it's not really intellectual history, to be honest. It's a history of practices and projects and objects.
Yes, I mean, that's really what is... I mean, of course, you mentioned it in the book, but it really is very noteworthy that you get all of these communities and practices and artifacts that are worth talking about, as opposed to just standard intellectual history of who inspired whom and what debates happened and what were the different contending sides of an academic argument.
Yeah, I mean, when I first got interested in cybernetics, I started reading general accounts of what cybernetics was or is, and all about servo mechanisms and thermostats and negative feedback, and it sounds really boring.
Yes.
Original books by these people, and what they were doing was just incredibly interesting.
I found the split between what we call the sort of American versus British cybernetics to be really fascinating, because I read Norbert Wiener and a couple others of the American sort, and I was you put it very well, that it's this very austere science of command and this sort of thing, and I was okay, that's not as interesting, but Beer and these other guys, wow, what an incredibly different world, you know.
I mean, you know, Wiener sold a lot of books, but he really wasn't a very good writer apart from anything else.
Yeah, and
no fun reading Wiener at all.
Yeah, a book that is kind of purchased by many people, but not really probably consumed in any depth by most of the people who bought it.
He actually wrote a novel. I don't know if you know that.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's about a young engineer in America building control systems, and it's absolutely the dullest book you've ever read. I mean, I forced myself to read it because it was by Norbert Wiener, but nobody else would, I don't think.
Well, I guess we have a sort of collection of questions that we've sort of mapped out, but I mean we can go over anything as well, if anything pops to mind. But I guess Kyle, why don't you maybe pick one off the queue and we'll start from there.
Yeah, sure. So I think you were mentioning how this book, The Cybernetic Brain, kind of covers a selection of very interesting and eccentric men. And I was wondering if you came across any women in the field who were kind of deeply involved in this sort of eccentric work.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, this basically, I'm writing about a bunch of rather old-fashioned English men. It's true. If I try to think about important women in the history of cybernetics in Britain, I don't think there are any.
Yeah, so do you think that is kind of related in some way to its lack of institutional basis, or this kind of nomad character of cybernetics?
If you wanted a kind of straightforward explanation, you could say there's, an engineering side to cybernetics. Gordon Pass is, one of the most imaginative people you can think of, but he was always building gadgets. There weren't many women engineers, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Even today, there aren't many. The most eminent female cybernetician was definitely Margaret Mead in America. She was primarily an anthropologist, and that's a different kind of field. There have been plenty of women anthropologists. And
yes,
she was
of course.
Kind of over the cybernetics, not least because she married Gregory Bateson. But on the English side, very, very few women, I have to say.
Well, it wasn't exactly a women's world in the 50s in Britain, was it?
No. And there are a few women who feature in a story in the Cybernetic Brain.
Yes.
When Pask exhibited his famous colloquy of mobiles at the ICA in 1968, that was an exhibition called Cybernetic Serendipity, organized by a woman, Yasha Reichardt, who was a young curator in those days. And a friend of hers designed, who was also a woman theatrical designer, designed the shapes of the female robots in the colloquy of mobile.
That is quite interesting in a way, though, because there are sort of parts of the story where this kind of engineering sensibility intersects with the art world. And I guess there were kind of opportunities for women to participate to somewhat greater extent in those areas, even if they were not, quote unquote cyberneticians.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Yasha Reichardt was somebody who was involved in it. The trouble was that cybernetics was most important in the artwork in the late 1960s, which coincided with the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. People then decided that cybernetics was a bit too scientific and engineering, and they were bad things in the Vietnam War. So again, after, from the 70s onwards, they turned cybernetic art turned into more of an engineering thing practiced by a few men.
Right. So it was that that turn in the politics that kind of drove it back out of the broader art spaces in a way.
For different reasons. The 60s were the kind of high point of cybernetics. Various factors conspired against it after that. It was associated with the counterculture of the 60s, of course. Culture died in the 70s. The same thing happened to cybernetics, I'm afraid.
Well, we're hoping we can bring it back.
Yes.
And the 60s, and the counterculture.
So kind of moving on to another question we have here that in sort of recently, this Hylozoic perspective, or this cybernetic monism, has kind of become pretty popular especially among some forms of posthumanism. Do you see these developments as promising and kind of
Yeah, I do see them as promising. I mean, I think I was one of the first people who started talking about ontology. 20 years ago or something like that, claiming that ontology was going to be the big word of the 21st century. And, in a small way, I was right. There are now people who talk about, the new materialism, new vitalism. Even people will talk about animism. And I actually think that's the most interesting stuff happening in philosophy and social sciences these days. Exactly how you're going to get at, the liveliness and materiality of the world we live in is, different people answer the question differently. Writing about cybernetics is one of my ways of answering the question. A lively we can interact with.
Right.
Is what cybernetics is about.
So, sort of taking up that perspective and taking up the history that you have brought together in the Cybernetic Brain, did you find like that your work was like kind of well received in those circles, or that there was a kind of interest in cybernetics that developed among all those different new movements in philosophy and social science?
I don't know. I mean, in a way, when I was writing the book, I had this awful feeling that I was going to turn into one of my cyberneticians. I mean, as you know, I wrote about the fact that they didn't have any kind of solid institutional basis.
Yeah.
And they appealed to, other cybernetics types in all sorts of fields, right? So it was a kind of anti-disciplinary endeavor. And I guess I had the same feeling about my book, I mean, it's not central to any academic discipline, I'm sad to say. But a lot of people seem to find it really interesting, including you two, right?
Yes, absolutely.
It speaks to people, right?
It definitely does. And like I've found that, I mean, it's one of these phenomena where you start to, you see one thing, you see a green car, and then suddenly you're seeing green cars everywhere. But I'm definitely seeing like your book, The Cybernetic Brain, tying together a bunch of different threads, which I see everywhere else. That like
like what?
Well, I guess like I suppose this kind of like hylozoic perspective seems to be kind of like pretty popular. Like as we were saying that like. And complexity theories and this sort of stuff. Like, there's a lot of remnants of cybernetics everywhere. And a lot of things that I think we could tie back together with cybernetics. Like, it would give us a vocabulary to start kind of talking across different disciplines about all these commonalities.
That's very nice. I mean, maybe you shouldn't say remnants, you should say descendants, right?
Descendants,
yes.
Cybernetics.
Yeah.
The argument was that cybernetics is part of a different kind of non-modern paradigm. Yeah. So my project, and maybe your project as well, is to bring all descendants back together, right?
Yes.
Try and display their unitary character. Here's another way of understanding the world, here's another way of acting in it, and it covers, as many fields as you like. So, that's part of the politics of the project for me, trying to reassemble what I call this anti-disciplinary paradigm.
Yeah, and that's been very resonant for us, absolutely, on this podcast, because, we very much came from an anti-disciplinary background. We have no solid institutional basis for our work, and we just kind of happened to find each other through serendipity. So it felt like we could be a part of the sort of tradition that you outlined in the book. So getting to that sort of more kind of contemporary point, in the book, in the Cybernetic Brain, you emphasize the value of the way cybernetics makes a performative ontology practical. And I was wondering, what kind of practical projects or artifacts have you seen in recent years that realize this kind of ontology? Is there anything that stood out to you as like really interesting or exciting or a great example?
After I wrote the book, I tried to kind of follow these developments into areas that I hadn't written about already. That was, I was still interested in the same thing. How do you kind of act out this ontology of unknowability? But I wondered, what other directions it could go in. And the two big things that I've ended up concentrating on are first of all the arts. I talked a bit in the book about, cybernetic art. You picked up the thing about Brian Eno in one of your podcasts.
Yes.
There are many, many very exciting things happening in the art world these days that stage the kind of cybernetic ontology. Right? So, maybe I've written about that. Maybe I should write it at more length.
And I was going to say that's really interesting because I think we brought it up in the other episode, but I came from a music background, and a lot of the techniques that Eno sort of pioneered in music and that kind of cybernetic ontology sort of stuff, and setting up systems to generate music, is just taken for granted now as the standard way of doing things for so much experimental music. Yeah, it's a good touch point.
Yeah, experimental music. I mean, it's still in the margins, though, isn't it?
Well, there was I recently had the opportunity to visit the Team Lab Borderless installation art project in Tokyo, and that is by no means a fringe thing. It's a major installation project that is attracting huge crowds. So, I mean, that feels very much like a descendant of the kinds of art that is in the Cybernetic Brain. Certainly seemed to me at the time. So I think it has a popular audience, but maybe just not in the music world at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, I went to a fabulous exhibition in Paris just a couple of months ago. It's called Artists and Robots. Kind of cybernetic art, very beautiful stuff. A lot of people there. So it's not like it doesn't exist. On the other hand, if you just pick up, a national newspaper, I read the New York Times, just to keep track of what's going on. You never hear about stuff, right? In a sense, it's still over the horizon from mainstream culture.
Yes.
The New York Times is all about the latest $125 million sale of Leonardo da Vinci or something like that. Right. Culture, that's what the art was.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I wonder if these artifacts are too ephemeral to attract the the art auction crowd.
No, I mean, certainly one story is that you have to care for cybernetic artworks in a different way from paintings and sculpture.
That's absolutely.
So curators don't know what to do. The British Museum has got a tortoise, one of Grey Walter's little robot. It doesn't work anymore.
Is it just sitting there? Yeah.
Just to wander around and do things and to find light. But nobody can keep it going, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, having said that, a friend of mine is actually rebuilding the famous colloquy of mobiles, Gordon Peck.
Oh.
Yeah, that's Detroit. If you look it up on the web, you can probably find pictures of it.
Okay, we'll try and find a link to that for the show notes, yeah. Yeah, so just picking another question off the queue here, that in the Cybernetic Brain we get this wonderful picture of the history of British cybernetics, but were there any other national or transnational cybernetic projects that caught your interest during your research?
No.
That's a very good answer.
I mean, it was the other way around. I didn't say to myself, I'm going to start studying British cybernetics. I said to myself, I'm going to find out what it is about cybernetics that interests me.
Yes.
And I kind of homed in on, various books and articles. And then I thought, my goodness, they're all by Englishmen. Right?
Yep.
In the States, Warren McCulloch claimed to be an honorary Scotsman. I mean, and of course, Gregory Basin was English, although he went to live in America.
Right.
And for some reason that I don't really understand, the British were especially drawn to the kind of cybernetics I talk about.
It's very interesting, isn't it? And because it's not as though the sort of tinkering engineering experimental tradition is really foreign to all that many other places, even though it's, maybe most famously associated with Britain. But nevertheless, there's something about that group that is very interesting and special.
Right. I mean, because they weren't a group to start off with.
Right, that's true.
They came to this from different angles. And eventually they coalesced, especially around, Norbert Wiener and his book. The quote from Stafford Beer is, "My God, I'm a cybernetician."
Yes. Wonderful.
In England during the Second World War, there was a lot of scientists were involved in the war effort, and the word for them was boffins. I don't know if you know the word boffin.
Yes.
But Boffin is kind of a Doctor Who kind of character, if you know who Doctor Who is.
Yes.
Somebody, very clever, very resourceful, probably has got a sonic screwdriver, and, can sort out any problem. And these guys are kind of Boffin-like. Right? They're not super professional MIT mathematicians like Wiener.
Right.
They were, because my guys weren't really involved in the war at all. So I think I'm rambling a bit. Ask me a different question.
Well, I guess maybe a follow-up question would be: we've looked at a little bit of the Soviet cybernetics, and it didn't really take off in the way this. But was that a part of your study at all?
No, because I did learn a bit of Russian when I was a schoolboy, but I can't read Russian. I'm friends with Slava Gerovich.
Oh, yes.
Who wrote the first important book on cybernetics in Russia, which is called From Newspeak to Cyberspeak, or vice versa, which is very much, it was frustrating for me because it's very much an institutional history. First of all, Cybernetic was very unpopular. Then it became very popular, enormous institutes of cybernetics. And then it became a kind of contentless way of speaking. So it's kind of very frustrating to me. I didn't know what they were doing with the cybernetics.
I suppose it's very different from the British stuff because, the Soviet Union was all institutions all the time and didn't have that wiggle room for weird boffin types to do whatever they wanted.
Yeah, I don't know. There's some weird ones. Some weird, very idiosyncratic Russians in history. There are at least two books. There's Red Plenty, which I think you did a podcast about.
Yes.
Which is a very idealistic kind of operations research, economics, kind of cybernetics people who are trying to figure out how to optimize the Soviet economy. I think that was the big thing in the Soviet Union that they called cybernetics. I would call it operations research or some kind of economic modelling. But it's not the kind of performative experimental stuff that interests me about British cybernetics. Well, I didn't, try writing about Soviet cybernetics very much at all.
Yeah, I
there are many different kinds of things that have been called cybernetics.
Yes.
With, the internet, for example, cyborgs, and all of these things have a kind of family resemblance to one another. But they all have different histories, really. And some seem more interesting and more politically exciting and more mysterious than others. And that's the way I think of it.
Yeah, and I think sort of getting to that definitional question, one thing that kind of stands out to me in reading the book or looking at other examples of cybernetics is that diagramming is a very important practice in cybernetics, it seems. How do you think that practice contributes to the kind of performative ontology that you identify as the core of your history?
I don't think I got the faintest idea. You defeated me.
Oh no.
No, it's an interesting question. I mean, is it true that everybody I wrote about built machines? No. Most of them built machines, and you find circuit diagrams, logic diagrams, Pask would map out how the different bits related to one another. One kind of relevant point that I made in the book was concerned this thing I called the cybernetic discovery of complexity, which is that if you just join a few simple components together with a couple of feedback loops, they tend to behave in such a complex fashion that they become unpredictable.
Yes.
So Craig Walter said he couldn't predict what his tortoises would do. And there were many things about homeostats that Ross Ashby just couldn't predict. You had to build these machines and find out what they would do. So, diagrams of a multiplicity of components attached to one another at least feed into this ontological point about a world that's so complicated, full of exceedingly complex systems that we can never understand it. It'll all do things that surprise me. Having said that, I'm still thinking about your question. Gregory Bateson didn't draw diagrams. Right? And he was, anthropologist turned psychiatrist turned animal behaviorist.
Right.
He just wrote very enigmatic English, but I can't think of any drawings.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, that is. I guess that in some ways it could at least kind of serve as a starting point for thinking about those unpredictable performances that you might bring about, and maybe a way of abstracting them as a stepping stone to some other performance you might stage.
Well, so there was the point in the book that you had in the book about for these cyberneticians, like representational modeling was reduced to an epistemological tool that was in service of the ontology rather than being a kind of totalizing model. So maybe that's the role of the diagramming, is just as a helper to get you into the next performance. Yeah.
Try thinking that if you want to.
Yep. The thing that really got my imagination going on that topic was just sort of the way that Beer was using diagrams of the body, diagrams that were, yantras, geometric diagrams, all these kinds of different diagrams, all within this kind of cybernetic practice.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. It's clever of you to pick that out.
No.
I just don't know where to go with it. I'd never really regarded the diagrams as problematic. I must be a diagram person myself.
I think there's something kind of haunting about the Beer's diagrams, though, like the sort of combination of a sort of pseudo-biological diagrams with this like corporate and technical sort of layouts is quite haunting in some instances.
Yeah, I mean, he also was an artist, right? I mean, he's a poet, but he was an artist. If you look at his handwriting, it's got very beautiful flourishes in it. Because he was addressing himself to the corporate world, the government world. So the diagram of the viable system model was like his trademark for a long time.
Yes.
The other beautiful, well, I don't know if it's beautiful, it's the picture of the icosahedron, which is the center of disintegration. There are so many amazing diagrams. I was going to say I'm kind of annoyed about diagrams. Maybe that's why I can't answer your question.
I see.
Put one on the front of the front cover of my book. You do a Chicago Press, and it's a very boring kind of logic diagram. People do associate with the Cold War, right?
Yes.
Which is completely the wrong picture as far as I'm concerned. I wanted to have a painting by what's his name. It'll come back to me. But, all right. Sorry. Carry on.
Yeah. I guess one other sort of point that stuck with me from the book was in the conclusion you sort of talk a little bit about education and its relationship to cybernetic performance. I was wondering, like, have you had a lot of sort of personal experiences of trying to implement some kind of cybernetic education program or curriculum personally, or is that something you've seen other people experiment with? It's as a teacher, it's quite interesting to me. Selfishly, I have to ask this question.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I've taught this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And I've asked students to read stuff about cybernetics, but as I was saying earlier, cybernetics is just an example of a much wider pattern and paradigm, that you can find everywhere, this kind of transformative experimentation. So, I spend entire semesters teaching this stuff to students. Mm-hmm. And the hard thing for them is to try to get the hang of what the course is about, because it is coming from a different angle from everything most things they've learned before.
Yes.
But my personal experience is students often really enjoy it. I mean, at the end they say things like, "Oh, you opened my eyes."
That's
good. That's precisely what you want, isn't it?
Yeah, that is precisely what you want.
So, I mean, at the end of the book, I was just kind of imagining scaling that up to the size of a university, right?
Right.
So this university that I was imagining would teach, a whole load of fields from the perspective of cybernetics, or this kind of ontology of becoming, right?
Right.
And there are, so many fields. You can find examples of that, and you could very easily teach, undergraduates how to think about the world in that way, how to act in different areas in that way. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could do it. That was my fantasy, to start a new university. Evidently, I did not do that. But.
Well, it's going to be out there in the world now. There'll be many people listening to this podcast, and maybe one of them will start that university. Yeah.
When you're appealing for money, if anybody's got a few £1 million, they would like
flying around.
That's in a new university. And you can imagine teaching school children. Maybe actually it would be more strategic to teach children when they're 5 years old to get the hang of these ways of thinking and acting. And then, the important thing is they don't even have to do that. They don't have to do it to the exclusion of, kind of modern sciences, but just as, it's something else that they have available to them. So the next time, we set off to kind of dominate the environment and risk some enormous catastrophe, it'd be great if a lot of people said, this isn't natural. We don't have to behave this way,
Right.
differently. We don't have to keep risking the planet or, propagating this war of terror day after day, day after day.
Yes.
Just to realize that maybe we can get out of these arms races, which is basically what they are, I think.
Yeah, right. Personally, I was kind of inspired by the book to try to implement it in some of my classes, and I made an experiment of trying to teach English by means of a game design class to make it sort of iterative and reflexive and performative, and I've had mixed results, but I'm not going to give up. Going to stick with it, because I think there's you can see the quality of the classroom change when you introduce these kinds of methods of pedagogy. That there's a certain amount of wonder and a different kind of way of thinking that does emerge.
That's very nice. I mean, if you get anywhere with it, tell me about it.
Absolutely.
I used to have a friend in America who used to come to all my seminars when I was teaching there. Who was I think he was quite a leading programmer, and his thing was Agile computer programming. Do you know that?
Yeah.
Well, I could imagine you could try and do something like that in, your class in game design.
Yes, of course.
They were going to collectively produce some little bit of action, see what emerges, and next week we'll add something else to it.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the idea. Agile is a kind of collective way of precisely constructively exploring the unknown without planning everything out in advance. That was the way he used to talk about it.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I'm a software developer by day, and that's definitely an accurate sort of take on Agile, yeah. And I think maybe one of the things I'm interested in doing is bringing cybernetics back into software or like technical development sort of stuff, because that's one of those threads, that we were on about earlier, that is that has a lot of the echoes of cybernetics in it, but could do with being reintroduced.
Yeah, I mean, probably the very suggestive contrast that Beer wrote about, which I talk about in the book, is in conventional computing, we kind of, silicon chips, you have to arrange matter almost atom by atom to make a chip that'll do what you want. And then you have to program it operation by operation. And Beer's fantasy in the late 50s and early 60s, instead of doing that, to find some very lively bit of matter and try and persuade it to help you in whatever it was you wanted to do, rather than torturing a load of silicon.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating line of thought. Really, I mean, I'm sure it's captured the imaginations of many people, but it certainly captured mine.
Yeah. It's reminiscent of the way we do machine learning now, which is sort of, I mean, it's still using traditional silicon, but there's the turn towards using that kind of, here's a cluster of neurons or virtual neurons, and we're just going to throw information at them until they adapt to whatever pattern we want to match.
Right, and the network is, trying this set of connection, trying another one. It's precisely a kind of performative experimentation, and then the feedback take it, encourages this trial and error to home in onto. In the end, it's telling cats from dogs and things like that, isn't it? But the process is very interesting. And of course, neural networks grow out of cybernetics from a different angle.
Yes.
I had to talk about that.
I noticed that when I was reading Brain of the Firm, that a lot of the anastomotic reticulum that Beer talks about is essentially a neural network, and it's okay, there's a weird echo there to those ideas. Yeah.
I couldn't even say that word.
Yeah.
I think that this idea of lively matter is also very interesting, and I'd be very interested if someday some people started doing liveliness studies, finding lively things to interact with and thinking about them. Yeah,
I think that's really interesting because it's sort of there's a technical sort of blind spot in a lot of mainstream technical thinking of trying to construct synthetic constructs that have desirable properties. I saw a thing the other day of a self-assembling material that assembles itself out of carbon from the air, and I just thought, what, a tree? Those things exist. Why are you trying to research that? Just use a tree. Yeah, I guess so. One of the last sort of questions we had mapped out was that if you had the opportunity to write one more chapter for the Cybernetic Brain, which person or topic would you focus on?
Yeah, well, I mean, in a way, it is my intention to write a book that would carry on from the Cybernetic Brain. I guess everything I've ever written carries on from whatever it was that I wrote before.
Sure.
So in this case, I mean, I would write about cybernetic approaches to the arts and to environmental management. And I might throw in a bit of Eastern philosophy and try and tie it to a general discussion of other ways of being in the world. So I'd like to contrast these cybernetic ways of being more systematically with the kind of dominating and enframing ways that we usually go on it, right?
Sure.
So in a way, I do have a kind of entire book in my mind. It's just that the more I think about it, it tends to get more complicated, which I don't like. But you have to say, you have to make too many qualifications, you lose the line of the argument. So that's why you can't go out and buy this book at the moment.
Well, it's a very fitting problem given the subject matter, I suppose. Yeah. We all have to manage complexity in some ways, I suppose. The last sort of question I'd like to ask is, given that this is kind of a politics podcast, there's a lot of sort of political foment at the moment. And there has been a kind of revival of interest in things like Project Cybersyn, in the sort of left these days. So do you think that there is? Do you think that these things are moving in a kind of constructive direction? That there's a chance that these kind of ideas could actually get integrated into some kind of party platform or some kind of institution? Is that something you see around you these days?
To a limited extent.
Mm-hmm.
Well, right. I've been trying to be optimistic since the end of the second millennium. And I keep being disappointed. I think I'm wasting my time here. So there are two angles on the politics. What I tried to talk about in the book was a kind of practical politics, which was a politics of practice, right?
Mm.
So cybernetics hangs together with a set of ways of acting in the world that don't try to dominate the material world or other people, but try to find out experimentally about, how things will go. What does this river want to do? That's what I mean by a different, systematically different way of being in the world.
Yes.
And I think this systematic difference is political, right? It's not political on the level of left and right.
Right.
But it makes a difference as far as, group domination and the kind of catastrophes that go with that, contrasted with curiosity, finding out, a kind of joyous optimism about what the future might hold. That's a big political choice. And I suppose, one thing I'm trying to do in my work is make it clear that there is this kind of choice. We talked about it before, right?
Yes.
So there's a kind of possibility there. I don't know how real it is. It would be great to bring all the threads of this alternative paradigm together. Like we talked, and who knows, maybe just the right person is listening to your podcast when it comes out. I nearly got run over by a Tesla just before I came home to talk to you, which was going silently down this lane. And I thought, who's the guy that makes Teslas? He's got so much money, he could finance the whole thing for us if he wanted.
Well, seems to be a little bit of an unreliable character.
The other political thing, the kind of new conventional politics in the world probably started with the Occupy movement. How to bring people together democratically to make decisions instead of, this kind of one-off, one-bit choice that we get every 5 years in England. We can vote for the Tories or the Labour Party and that's it. Kind of non-hierarchical decision-making seems to be on a lot of people's agenda. It was also what people were trying to do in the 60s in the counterculture.
Yes.
Places like Kingsley Hall. We haven't talked about psychiatry, interestingly enough. And the anti-university tried to be a totally democratic body. And there are other examples of this. And they all failed, right?
Yes.
And they failed because if you get more than three people trying to talk to each other, the conversation just never ends, right? The system never settles down into an equilibrium. This is what that Ross Ashby tried to talk about when he talked about a collection of homeostats all interacting with one another.
Right.
If if there was a few of them, they could come into equilibrium in 2 seconds. If there was 100, they would take longer than the life of the universe. And it's the same problem with Occupy and the anti-university and all of these hierarchical institutions. And that is actually why Stafford Beer is so interesting. He was inventing ways to cut down the variety involved in decision-making without creating hierarchical centers. So the interesting thing about cyberscience, for me, is that the different levels kind of communicated experimentally and homeostatically. The top level would propose something to the next level down, which would come up with a counter proposal backwards and forwards until they could agree on something, and so on, up and down the chain. And the point there is, it's completely different from conventional management, where the people at the top make decisions and transmit them as orders to the people at the bottom. It's what British universities do, actually. I mean, that's a very real way. Yeah. So Stafford Beard invented another way, which tries to involve everybody but cuts down the variety. Actually, that syntegration icosahedron we mentioned was an example of how you could join the different levels of the viable system model together. And every position on that icosahedron is isomorphous with every other position. There is no special position. At the same time, not everybody is talking to everybody else at once. There's a kind of dance here. I talk to those people, then I talk to another bunch, and then I come back to the first bunch. So you cut down the variety and you make the conversation manageable without putting anybody in charge. That's a different kind of politics, which is very interesting. And I think, then the question is, what's happened to the Occupy movement? Mm-hmm. There's still interesting things happening in Spain. I know a former student of mine is working there. Are things going in the right direction in that respect? You tell me.
I think we would very much like to bring, the viable system model and Beer's ideas into the realm of emancipatory politics, because I think, there's an enormous potential there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not so sure that all the wiring and the telexes and the one computer were really the important thing about cyber science. I mean, people talk about it as being a kind of imaginative forerunner of the internet, which is kind of interesting, I think. But what most people miss are these kind of the homeostatic couplings within the viable system.
Yeah, it's certainly what I found more compelling about the project than it's part of the technical history of networking, right? Yeah.
Some people say its great triumph was to break the Gremio strike. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure you want to boast about breaking the strike.
Yeah.
It was the bad people who were on strike. No doubt the CIA was behind it.
Yes.
Strike breaking doesn't have a great record, I think.
It's not a great look.
Well, I guess is there anything else you'd like to talk about before we wrap up?
Me? Well, I mean, I have the feeling that today we've covered most of the important topics, which for me would be something like the connection between the ontology of cybernetics and all the weird and wonderful practices that go with the ontology and the politics of the whole thing. So, I mean, I think that was great. I'm not congratulating myself.
Sure.
And of course, your previous podcasts also bring all sorts of stuff to life from the history of cybernetics. Maybe the other things to think about might be, the cybernetic psychiatry, Lang and Bates, and the image of the self that goes with cybernetic psychiatry, the idea that the selves of the psychiatrists were also likely to change in psychiatric therapy.
Oh, that's been as a game designer, that part of the book has been a big inspiration for me. I know, in terms of how I think about designing tabletop games, it's really given me some new ideas.
Yeah, well, that's amazing. And I was going to say another thing we could have talked about more would have been cybernetic art.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the art and the psychiatry and the selves probably all come together in game design if you think about it that way.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
You can have it all.
Yeah, well, it's maybe why I love it so much. Well, yeah, I think, in the future we may get to cover the rest of the book, and that would be wonderful as well. So, yeah.
You can make it a series, it'll run and run.
We probably should, yeah. Do the rest of the chapters piece by piece, yeah, certainly.
Yeah, take a few more years over.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
It was fantastic. I think the listeners will appreciate this. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Take care.
I thought that was a really great interview. It was very gracious of him to take some time out to speak to us as well. But I loved it, especially on the political points. Yeah, that there really is this hope for another way of being that isn't based on domination and just sort of rank kind of brutality against each other and against nature. It's heartening,
Yeah. I mean, I feel like, it's an aspiration that is commonly held and, has been held by many people over the ages, going back at least to the Anabaptists or something. Or, well, there's, all around the world, this is a sort of thing that pops up from time to time. And I guess in the modern age, it's been a recurring thing as well, as he mentioned, in the 60s during the Occupy movement. It comes back and comes and goes, but I think the promising thing is that cybernetics can give us a way to think about this constructively instead of just stating the desire.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, and it can help us to bridge across all sorts of different disciplines with a common vocabulary, so that we can make sense of things. I mean, we went through that in the interview, that there's all sorts of different threads that can be tied back together. And yeah, I mean, one of them is emancipatory politics, right? That there's enormous potential for applying, especially the viable system model, but even cybernetic notions in general, applying them to emancipatory politics, I think is extremely promising. And that's why we're doing the show, right? right, absolutely. And as it looks increasingly likely that labor might get into power, I sincerely hope that some of these lessons are brought into the many problems that they will confront in government. Yeah. And hey, if we've got any labor insiders listening, hit us up when that day comes.
Yes.
Yep. No, definitely. This has been that was a really great conversation. And yeah, I'll try and find the art installation he was talking about for the show notes as well. So check out the show notes for some cool links, maybe.
Yeah, probably throw in that Borderless exhibition in there too, because it really is a descendant of the kind of art you find in the Cybernetic Brain, and maybe, I don't know, maybe I'll do some kind of monologue or essay or something about my experience of the installation, because I think it is sort of a work of art on the order of something that you might have seen in the World's Fair or
sure, right.
Kind of a historic project, a very ambitious project, and one that has a lot of mass appeal. and so it's probably worth reflecting on in that sort of cybernetic lens. But that's all dependent on time. So
yeah,
we'll see.
Time's a bit of an issue these days.
Yeah.
But I guess that's it. I mean, great interview. I think we should get around to covering the rest of the book in probably pieces, like over the next year or so. We should do the Bates and Lang chapters, I think. Or is that just one chapter?
I believe that was one chapter, but don't hold me to it.
Who knows? We'll figure it out. Yeah, we really should finish it off because amazing book. Fantastic. Thanks, listeners, for listening to this. And if you appreciate this sort of stuff, you can follow us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. You can find us on Facebook. You can subscribe to the feed as well. It's a nice way to keep up with us. Or if you want to support the show explicitly with a couple of bucks a month, you can go to patreon.com/General Intellect Unit, and so give us a little bit of money to help cover things like books and hosting costs and such. But yeah, otherwise, thanks for listening, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks with a new episode. Goodbye.
Bye.